What do you see as maybe the three most important issues facing the country today? And if there are more than three, go at it.
Yeah, well, maybe we only have time for three.
Well, that could be.
But I would say the big issue facing us right now is economic growth. And I've talked about this a little bit, but we right now are growing as a country at around 1.5%. And to put that into context, historically we've grown at 3.5%. So we're growing at about Depression era levels here, even though it doesn't feel like the Great Depression, of course, because we have this social safety net. Our economic growth is stagnant. We've got to improve that. That means we need real tax reform, real regulatory reform, real healthcare reform, and real energy reform. And I believe you do those few things, and you have a strong, stable dollar policy, this country is going to take off. And it's not going to take 10 years to do it. We're going to take off in 1 or 2 years because there's a lot of capital sitting on the sidelines. There's a lot of people that are just itching to get back to work. And I believe you free up that capital and you have that labor force there and people understand that there's going to be regulatory reform and that they're going to have affordable energy and that the tax rate's going to come down for businesses, this country is going to take off again. So that's got to be number one. And number two, in a close second, we've got to reduce spending. No doubt about it. We can grow all day, but if we continue with these ridiculous spending levels that we have, we could very well bankrupt the country. So we've got to get a handle on that. I would encourage voters to really look at what their members, their candidates for Congress are saying about spending and really hold their feet to the fire on it. And number three, we've got to have obviously a national defense, a strong national defense, and you know, terrorism hasn't knocked too loudly on the doorstep in recent years, but it's there and we need to guard against it.
Yeah. Now you've seemed very passionate on you know, some of the questions that I've asked. Are there any specific issues that maybe we haven't talked about that really drive your passion?
Well, we've got to have a stable dollar, and I mentioned that a little bit, and I think that starts with a complete audit of the Federal Reserve. And why is it so important for us to have a stable dollar? Well, inflation could be around the corner. And if you're someone that's on a fixed income, you're a retiree receiving Social Security, you're someone living on dividends or on savings, watching your dollar devalue every year is a huge cost. It's really a hidden tax. And I believe, especially right now, with so many Americans transitioning into retirement, the prospect of inflation around 10–15% is very, very dangerous, not just for individual accounts, but nationally, it's a huge danger economically. So let's rein in the Fed. Let's do a complete audit. Let's make sure we know what's on the books, because at the end of the day, we also have to remember that the Federal Reserve is a private bank set up by Congress. And so I think it ought to be, if it's going to be controlling the money supply, we ought to know what's going on behind those doors.
Maybe be a little more accountable as well.
There you have it.
Something that I've talked about with some guests in the past, and I've been a proponent of for 30 years of my adult life, term limits. Do you have a position on that? And just to tell our audience a little bit about, you know, what your feelings may or may not be on that.
Sure, Bruce. I support term limits, and you know, most importantly, my wife supports term limits. So I've self-term limited myself to 10 years, no more than 10 years. And frankly, I believe we're going to know whether or not we've solved the problems in Congress well before that. And so if we solve those problems, it's time to come home. And if we failed, well, then it's time to come home as well. I will support legislation for term limits. And I believe it's not just, you know, it's going to be tough to pass that into law, though, I'll tell you now, because we got a lot of people in Congress that have been there for a long time, and they control those committees where the legislation goes through, and a lot of them don't like the idea of term limits. So that's why I proposed we ought to have term limits for folks in these committee spots. And we ought to maybe elect the committee chairman, not from a very small group of people in the congressional leadership, but from the floor of the House of Representatives. And if you make that an elected position, I think a lot of the incentives for people to stick around Congress for decades upon decades, waiting for that chairmanship, waiting for that chairman's gavel, a lot of that goes away. So if we do real reforms in Congress, if we have term limits on those chairman jobs, if we make it an elected position by the House of Representatives, not an appointed position by the congressional leadership, I think you'll see people leave Congress early on their own accord.
Well, that would be welcome. To me, I've always felt that the whole idea about term limits would reduce some of the power of some of the long-term occupants of the House, and the whole revolving door of Washington types. You're in the government, you're out of the government as a lobbyist, you're back in the government, and some different. Do you have anything you'd like to share with our viewers on that?
Well, the revolving door issue is a big problem. And this whole idea that you're going to be a congressman for 20 years and then have a one-year cooling off period and go right into lobbying, I think that doesn't sit well with Americans. If you decide you're going to serve in Congress, you ought to be willing to forego a lobbying career afterwards. And maybe legally this isn't something we can do, ban people from life from that pursuit, but make it a longer period of time. Make it 5-10 years or something that's going to deter people from getting into public service just so they can make big bucks afterwards.
Yeah. Well, we're getting close to our show, end of the show. Are there maybe a couple of things you'd like to leave with our audience? Something maybe you wanted to expand upon, or something that you'd like to add?
Well, this is a very important seat. It's an open seat, which means, of course, there's not an incumbent running for re-election. And for Republicans in Connecticut, this is extremely critical because it's the most Republican seat we have in Connecticut, and it's the only open seat we have in Connecticut. And right now, as you know, we don't have any Republican elected officials at the congressional level or at the statewide level.
Right.
And I believe if we win this seat, it's going to change the politics in Connecticut. And it's going to change the course of this state because it's going to allow us to have a foothold from which to help build the Republican Party in the state and to put forward a lot of these issues, which I think have been overlooked and swept under the carpet, not just by the politicians but by the media, because we haven't had any Republicans willing to stand up and really fight for it at the federal level. Well, we've got some good people in Hartford that are trying to do that now, but I think they could really be supported with a Republican congressman in the 5th District.
Okay. Actually, there was one other point that I'd like to make, maybe a little bit, I'm not sure how familiar you may or may not be with Social Security and some of the facts, and I've touched on this with some other guests. Just a couple of facts regarding Social Security, and then we'll wrap up. And if you have some comments, please jump in. First, Social Security being created in 1935 under the FDR administration, the first recipient of Social Security was Ida Mae Fuller of Vermont. She paid in $44 in Social Security taxes and lived to age 100, long enough to receive almost $21,000 in benefits. In 1950, the decade I was born, there were 16 workers supporting every retiree. Today, there are just over 3 workers supporting every retiree. Now, I'm a numbers guy. Hopefully people out there can get a grasp of this with the numbers on Social Security. By 2030, just 18 years from now, we'll be down to just 2 workers supporting every retiree. And you're going to have to work hard because I'm going to be retired at that point. Back in 1940, for those who lived to age 65, just a few years again after Social Security came into being, men lived on average another 12.7 years, and women lived on average another 14.7 years. Today, a couple both age 65, the probability of one living to age 85 is 84%. The probability of one living to age 90, that's age 90, is 63%. And the probability of one of the couple living to age 95 is 36%. Now, as we've been talking, and you know, I'm pleased to hear Justin being a budget hawk and a fiscal hawk. These numbers, I don't care how you want to massage them, they just are not going to add up. Something, there's no question, has to be done. We need people that will think a little differently. going to Washington and also maybe to a lesser degree to Hartford, because this isn't a Hartford problem, but we need people that will think a little differently and outside the box. Again, I just wanted to get that out there. Is there anything that you've had to add to that?
Well, I'm 36, so I can't speak from experience per se on the program, but what I will say is this: there have been some proposals put forward for reforms. You know, it's funny down in Washington, you always hear about another commission being put forward, another blue ribbon commission, and you know, the president did have his commission on Social Security and on spending, and hasn't followed his own commission's recommendations. So I think there's some recommendations that we can look at that came out of the Debt Commission. But I also believe that the best way to preserve Social Security for future generations is through economic growth and through higher tax receipts that are going to come from economic growth. And so if we can grow this economy where it's been historically, a lot of those problems are going to melt away. But we can also talk about reforms that have to be done as well. And those ought to be done on a bipartisan basis, because programs like Social Security and Medicare, these are huge programs. The Democrats need to really bite the bullet and come to the negotiating table and help the Republicans get a bipartisan solution.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, now we're going to wrap up our show. Again, I'd like to thank our guest, Justin Bernier, candidate for the Republican nomination to become your next U.S. Congressman from Connecticut's 5th District. I'd also like to remind our viewers that air dates for our show, Brookfield Public Advocate, are on Charter Channel 21 on Mondays at 4:30 and Thursdays at 7 p.m. We also post segments up on YouTube. We'd love to hear from you, whether it be comments on a show that we've done, ideas for new shows, guests you'd like to see, or ideas or topics for future shows. Again, you can contact us at brookfieldpublicadvocate@yahoo.com. Again, thanks for watching and good night.